endangering the full faith and credit of the United States government is not necessarily a good approach to managing debt.
Hi, and welcome to GAO's Watchdog Report, your source for fact-based, nonpartisan news and information from the U.S. Government Accountability Office. I'm your host, Holly Hobbs. To prevent the federal government from defaulting on its debt when it neared the debt limit in 2023, Congress voted to suspend the debt ceiling through this coming January 1st. With that deadline looming, the decision of how to address national debt may be one of the first major decisions facing lawmakers after they are sworn in. In a new report, we looked at the potential widespread consequences of a government default on debt, including what we could see immediately and what could happen long term. We also looked at actions Congress could take to avoid this issue in the future. We'll find out more from GAO's Michael Clements and Mike Hoffman, who led work for a new report on this topic. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Holly.
Pleasure to be here.
So, Mike Clements, maybe we can start with, what is the debt limit and what does it mean to reach it?
Sure. So the debt limit is a legal limit on the total amount of federal debt that can be outstanding at any one time. If the government is at that debt limit and Treasury has obligations to pay, it then must use existing cash resources to meet those obligations.
So, how have we as a nation avoided reaching the debt limit so far?
So in actuality, we actually have been at the debt limit a number of times. In fact, since 2011, the federal government has been at the debt limit 12 times. What Treasury has managed to do in those situations, though, is a couple of things. One, Treasury can use existing cash to meet obligations. Treasury has what is known as the Treasury General Account. Think of a checking account for the federal government. So if there's money available, it can continue to make payments on obligations from that. Treasury can also engage in what are known as extraordinary measures. These are approaches that move debt around or allow Treasury to meet obligations without bumping up and going over that debt limit. The problem arises when the government is at the debt limit, Treasury has exhausted all those extraordinary measures, and the cash balance in the Treasury General Account is getting low. That's when a problem is going to arise. Thus far, we've been fortunate. Congress and the president have managed to either raise the debt limit and avoided the problem or suspended the debt limit. So as we sit here in December 2024, the debt limit is currently suspended, but only until January 1st of 2025. So in less than 30 days, we're going to be back in this situation again.
So since you brought up this looming deadline, what happens if the debt ceiling isn't raised? What could we see immediately?
If we're at the debt limit, Treasury has exhausted those extraordinary measures, and the cash runs out. That's going to be a problem at that instance. If that were to occur, Treasury is not going to be able to meet the government's obligations, and so therefore it's going to miss some payments. Might not be able to pay federal salaries, might not be able to pay Social Security benefits, or it might not be able to make interest and principal payments on outstanding debt. That would be a default. The problem with a default is that these Treasury securities are really the backbone for the financial system in the United States. Treasury securities serve as collateral. So, for example, if a bank needs to borrow money, it will oftentimes pledge Treasury securities as collateral to get those loans. Treasury securities are also, the interest rates on them serve as a benchmark interest rate. So, for example, a loan to a small business is oftentimes a multiple of a Treasury security interest rate. So you can imagine what would happen if we have a default. The counterparty may not accept Treasury securities as a collateral. Interest rates are likely going to go up because people won't trust Treasury securities as much. That's going to cause interest rates to go up for small businesses and households. So a lot of negative sort of short-term effects. A number of our listeners may have investments in money market mutual funds. That market could be disrupted. And again, you could see contractions of credit for businesses and also consumers.
Mike Hoffman, we've also looked at the potential long-term consequences. What do we think might happen?
So how serious the long-term consequences could be probably depends a lot on the length of the default. Are we talking about a default that lasts a couple hours? Or are we talking about a default that lasts a number of weeks or even months? If we're talking about a protracted stalemate on the Hill that lasts weeks or months, those financial market consequences that Mike mentioned would migrate to the economy as a whole and have real consequences for American households. So we're talking about potentially a major recession and serious damage to the economy. Many of the experts we spoke with talked about a recession that might look like the global financial crisis, or what we now call the Great Recession. So to put that in perspective, the Great Recession involved 8 million lost jobs, the stock market value was cut in half, and the economy shrunk by 4%. International investors would also begin to look at the United States financial system and its safety a bit differently. Historically, the United States has been viewed as a safe haven. The dollar has been a safe haven asset. These investors would begin to look at the United States as a higher risk investment and would probably begin to charge U.S. borrowers, including the Treasury, higher interest rates to compensate for that risk. At the same time, we think that a U.S. default as a result of the debt limit could have some negative consequences for U.S. fiscal health. So again, ironically, something called the debt limit, which sounds like it's designed to improve U.S. fiscal health, could cause a default, that could cause a recession, a large drop in tax revenues for the federal government, higher interest rates, making borrowing more expensive for the U.S. Treasury. These things combine to increase the deficit and make the debt worse and not limit it in any way.
You never hear about this happening in other countries. Is this a uniquely American problem?
No other country has a debt limit quite like the United States or quite as consequential as the United States. The debt limit began during World War I as a way to provide Treasury more flexibility to get Congress out of the business of approving every single debt issuance and instead provided Treasury more authority to issue debt when it needed to. However, the flexibility that Treasury had at the time is insufficient, and the limit has become more of a binding limit on Treasury as U.S. debt has grown.
You and Mike Clements have outlined some pretty stark potential outcomes. How do we know that could happen?
So the United States is fortunate that we don't have a history of default. Other countries, Argentina, for example, has defaulted 9 times. So there's a lot of experience with default, understanding the consequences of default. In the United States, we've been luckier. And as a result, we had to look elsewhere to get some confidence in projecting what these effects might be. So we did a number of things. We spoke with academic economists. We spoke with financial market professionals that would be on the front lines of managing the consequences of default. We looked at the effects of default in other countries that have experienced a sovereign default. We looked at quantitative projections by groups like the International Monetary Fund, Moody's Analytics, the Federal Reserve. And finally, we looked at episodes of significant financial stress in the United States and in the European Union. So while the United States hasn't experienced sovereign default, it has experience with financial crises that we think could be indicative of the consequences of default because of some of these effects that Mike mentioned.
So, our experts just outlined some stark potential consequences of the U.S. defaulting on its debt, which could include a potential recession on the scale of the Great Recession nearly 20 years ago. So, Mike Hoffman, how do we avoid all of this? How do we stop this kind of pattern of looming deadlines?
There are some alternatives that we studied and that we advise Congress to consider. Importantly, all of these alternatives provide Congress the essential control over spending and revenue while avoiding the risk of default. The sorts of fiscal reforms that would achieve this fall into 2 categories. The first is Congress provides Treasury with authority to raise the debt limit when it needs to in order to finance our bills and pay for spending that Congress has already approved. The other category of reforms that we advise Congress to consider is to automatically raise the debt limit when it approves a new budget, when it approves a new spending program, or when it approves, say, a new tax cut. All these reforms would better link Congress's spending and revenue decisions with the authority Treasury needs to pay the nation's bills.
Mike Clements, maybe you can take our last question. What's the bottom line of our report?
GAO has a long record of saying that the current fiscal path and the current levels of debt are simply unsustainable. However, endangering the full faith and credit of the United States government is not necessarily a good approach to managing that debt. As Mike mentioned, one of our recommendations here is for Congress to better align decisions on the total amount of debt and also its spending and revenue decisions. That's going to allow Congress to control the debt levels while also mitigating any possibility of these sort of very significant negative effects associated with a default.
That was GAO's Michael Clements and Mike Hoffman talking about our new report on the debt limit. Thanks for your time, Mikes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Holly.
And thank you for listening to the Watchdog Report. To hear more podcasts, subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And make sure to leave a rating and review to let others know about the work we're doing. For more from the Congressional Watchdog, the U.S. Government Accountability Office, visit us at gao.gov.